Hi, this is John Harcher, and welcome to the Valleys of Numenor Halloween special. Yeah, I know I said I was going to do a video and deal with the marketing of Lord of the Rings and everything, but things just got a little busy this month. So instead, I'm going to do an episode basically off the top of my head, and it's going to be about some Halloween pictures with a Jersey connection. Let's find out what it is. The Valleys of Numenor Halloween Special, or Oh, I'm a bad boy for not doing the episode I was supposed to. Now, when I wrote the intro to Valleys of Numenor, when I did the first episode there, I gave myself a little wiggle room. Started talking about sword and sorcery and fantasy and how they deal in the media, just to give me room to move in case I felt like doing something different. And this episode is definitely different than what we've been doing about Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and how the Rings of Power has been doing. And we'll get back to that next month when the book comes out, because I figure that's part of the marketing of the show, and we'll see how that all goes together. So instead, I'm doing a Halloween special, and it'll be about the films of a duo from New Jersey and how important their films were in the overall history. There's one in particular that's very important to horror films overall. So in the late 20s, Louis Castillo from Paterson, New Jersey, decided to head out to Hollywood and make his living as a stuntman. He was a short guy, but he was stocky. He was very athletic, so he could handle a lot of things like that. So while he was out there, he got exposed to a lot of the comedies that were out there. In fact, one of his most prominent early appearances is in the Laurel and Hardy film Battle of the Century. Now, he's not in the pie fight at the end. He's in the boxing match towards the beginning of the film. You could see him clearly. He's right in the center, and he's got like this Abraham Lincoln beard on. So a very clear early appearance of Lou. So after he was done with doing stunt work and everything, he decided to get into vaudeville. And he ran into another guy from New Jersey, William Abbott. They both decided to change their names. So Lou changed his last name from Castillo to Costello, and William Abbott decided to use his nickname Bud. Yeah, we're talking about Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. Now, they took a lot of the old vaudeville acts and kind of gave them a new kind of modern twist to kind of go to fit in good with like radio. So they became very popular radio personalities. And of course, I think it was in 1939 is when they first did the classic version of Who's on First. That was an old vaudeville routine, but they obviously created the definitive version. So they proved so popular that Universal signed them on to start. They wanted to try them out in films. They got some supporting roles in the movie One Night in the Tropics, which was actually a remake of an earlier film called Love Insurance. I think it was back in the early sound days. So they were second bill to Alan Jones, who was a singer who was done some work with the Marx Brothers on their famous movies, Night at the Opera and Day at the Races, and Bob Cummings, who later was very successful on TV with Love That Bob. So basically all they had them do was do a couple of their routines on film. They did a short version of Who's on First. They did Jonah and the Apples, and they did one or two others. And people were happy to see them. So Universal decided to give them their own film. So they came up with the film Buck Privates, and it was released in early 1941, before Pearl Harbor and everything. It was a smash hit. Universal couldn't believe how much money they came in. I think it was, if not their number one box office success that year, it was right near the top. Now, Universal already had them at work on another movie tentatively titled Oh, Chuck, Lou's, oh, Chuck, stuff like that. It was kind of going to be a haunted house film. There was a strain of comedy haunted house films right in that era. Technically, you could say it started with The Old Dark House in 1932, but that's more with the Universal first wave of horror films. So I'll maybe talk about that next year. But the wave in the late 30s, early 40s, you had movies like Bob Hope did two of them. He did The Cat and the Canary and Ghostbreakers, I think both with Paulette Goddard. Uh, Blondie had one of all things. The one that you can't see in syndication too much. Blondie Has Servant Trouble. Believe me, Horatio is way better than Stepin Fetchit and Manton Morris. Let's just say it that way. You could see it on streaming. It's not that bad a film. So, Oh Chuck was going to fit right into this type of film, but the Buck Privates was so successful, they previewed the film for audiences and they were confused. First thing they said, well, where were the Andrews sisters? Okay, well, the Andrews sisters didn't have anything to do with this movie. So they put that aside and came up with the movie In the Navy for Bud and Lou to do that. And that ended up being their second film following up Buck Privates. And that was also very successful. So after that, that's when they decided to go back to Oh Chuck and work on that. They changed the name from Oh Chuck to Hold That Ghost. And they were going to add some scenes in it to kind of link them to the other two. Like they ended up at the end of the movie sticking the Andrews sisters in there just to tie it together with the other two. So the basic plot of the film is Bud and Lou are gas station attendants, and they end up getting mixed up with a bunch of people who are going out to a haunted house, but it's really not a haunted house. It's a house where there's gangsters hiding, and there's hidden money in there. So they're going to go search it, but they get constantly frightened off. They frighten off the people, by pretending there's ghosts in the house and doing crazy things. This is the first film where they do the moving candle routine, where it's like Lou is sitting there and he's watching this candle move, and someone's sitting right next to him, and they don't see anything. They're paying attention, and then he tells them, "Go look at this candle." And they watch, but then the other candle starts to move. So in this movie, it's not so much Bud as his main compatriot. Lou has a lot of screen time with Joan Davis. She would become a star on radio and TV with I Married Joan, co-starring Jim Backus in his first big role outside of Mr. Magoo. So they actually had a pretty good chemistry on screen, and Lou actually never got a chance to work with a lot of female co-stars along the way, but he did end up having a good rapport with her, so it's a shame they weren't able to exploit it a little bit more in this film. And then during the reshoots of the movie, Joan couldn't make it. She was working over at 20th Century Fox, so they had to write her out of the end of the movie. There was actually another scene where they shot her from the back, and people think that it's like a replacement actress, but it actually was her. She just happened to be facing backwards at the time. So anyway, also in the cast, by the way, is Richard Carlson, who had a run of horror movies himself in the 50s, most famously first in It Came from Outer Space. Then he did a 3D movie called The Maze. It's you've ever seen this one? It's very weird. Take a look on YouTube. You'll be surprised who the master of the house is. And of course, his most famous horror movie is Creature from the Black Lagoon. So when Hold That Ghost is finally released, it's another box office success. Basically, they hit upon the right formula. Just a lot of comedy, some singing segments, and that basically was Bud and Lou's movies, I'd say pretty much through World War II, and then after the war is when they started changing. So we get to 1942, and everything looks like it's going great. Abbott and Costello become the number one box office stars in Hollywood. They ended up making 4 films for Universal that year, and then 1 for MGM. They got a provision in their contract with Universal that they could make 1 movie per year for another studio, so they made Rio Rita for them. They were so popular that they were actually caricatured in a whole bunch of Looney Tunes cartoons. They actually appeared in 4 different cartoons. 3 of them, they appeared as the characters as Babbitt and Costello. Now, the funny thing is the first time they appeared, they were cats. The second 2 times, they were mice, so I don't know why you stayed Costello. And then the 4th time, they were dogs in Hollywood Canine Canteen. Now, the interesting thing about the first cartoon that they were in, A Tale of Two Kitties, is they're 2 cats running around They're hungry. So they find this bird in a nest and they sneak up on it. And the bird says something very familiar as they peek in and then hide, duck back down. All of a sudden, the bird opens up and goes, I thought I saw a buddy cat. Yes, the very first Tweety cartoon didn't have Sylvester in it. It had Babbitt and Costello. Sylvester didn't show up until 1945, and I don't think they did their first cartoon until 1947. So Tweety was the victim in the first Babbitt and Costello cartoon. So everything looked like it's going well. Then in 1943, towards the middle of the year, I think after they finished filming Hit the Ice, Lou came down with rheumatic fever, and that pretty much knocked him out for the rest of the year. But the worst thing that happened was in November, his 1-year-old son, Lou Costello Jr., accidentally fell into the family swimming pool and drowned. Lou never got over it. He never forgave his wife for letting it happen. I remember my priest, Father Thomas, God rest his soul, actually did a sermon based on that, about how it's important in life to forgive people who make mistakes. And that's all it was. It was a horrible, tragic mistake. Unfortunately, it overshadowed Lou basically the rest of his life. So he recovers, and in 1944, they start getting back together, making movies, but it left a bad feeling between Bud and Lou, and they began to get estranged. And by 1945, they were under contract to make movies. They had just made their third for MGM. Their second, Lost in the Harem, was another hit in 44. But in 1945, they did Abigail in Hollywood, and it wasn't successful. So MGM decided not to make any more movies with them. So Bud and Lou were in a fight by that point. So they basically came up with the idea of basically doing a Lou Costello solo movie with Bud being kind of a co-star. He was in 1 or 2 scenes with them, and they did, I think they did the 13 times 7 is 21 routine in Little Giant. And the estrangement carried into 1946, where they actually ended up coming up with one of the best films they ever ended up doing. And it's another, oddly enough, another ghost story called The Time of Their Lives. In this one, Lou is a Revolutionary era tinker who actually gets a friendly letter from George Washington after helping them out with something. But Bud plays kind of his antagonist in the Revolutionary era, and he works for the host of the manor, who happens to be a Tory spy. And his girlfriend finds out about it, and she says they have to go tell General Washington. And Lou's Horatio Prim is like, oh, yeah, we got to go. He's a buddy of mine. So they go riding off, and unfortunately, they end up running into colonial guards who think that they're the traitors. They both end up getting shot and killed. And they dump their bodies into a well, and then they put a curse on them and says, you Tories are going to stay in this well. Unless something comes up that proves me wrong, you're going to stay condemned here. Now, it turns out there was evidence. The letter from George Washington ended up getting hidden in a clock in the house. So we fast forward through the centuries to the modern era, and Lou and the girlfriend, played by Marjorie Reynolds, as a brunette this time. Most people know her as the blonde from Holiday Inn, but she was a brunette this time out. They're stuck there, and the crew that comes in, they go to investigate the house just to see, and for its historical properties. And Gail Sondergaard is there, and she almost looks like she's made up to be Mrs. Danvers from Rebecca. In fact, I think Benny Barnes makes a joke about it, and I think Gail Sondergaard was actually up for the part, but she didn't get it. Judith Anderson did. So there's that going on. And Bud is there, and he actually plays the descendant of the guy who picked on Lou, Horatio, in the Revolutionary era, and he felt like he should make up for it and help them. After they actually do a seance and get in touch with them, they find the letter. So there's that dynamic going on. And one of the most interesting things is that this is the only time in his life Bud Abbott drove a car, because he had epilepsy and basically couldn't get a driver's license. So the one scene in the movie where he's in the car is like the only time he ever drove one in his life. And there's a happy ending. They eventually do find the letter, and they go to heaven. And Lou gets there just in time to find his Revolutionary era girlfriend, but unfortunately, heaven is closed for Washington's birthday. Even though the two were estranged at that point, they actually did kind of work together well, despite not being on the same physical plane. And this was one of the times when Lou did get to work with a female co-star. He worked with Marjorie Reynolds through basically most of the film. She wasn't quite a straight man, but I guess kind of in a way she was. But it's a very well done film, very, very heartwarming, and it's among the best they ever did. And maybe this helped get them back together again because they soon reconciled and set on towards their next bout with horror. So we get to 1947, and the ship's now starting to be righted. Bud and Lou are back together again. But they were kind of running a little low on ideas. They got desperate enough that they decided to do a sequel to Buck Private's Come Home. And it was funny. That was actually the second Abbott and Costello movie I saw. The first one was the next movie we'll be talking about. And so the weird thing was Channel 11, at least at the time when I was watching it, when they do their Abbott and Costello movies, they didn't really show Buck Privates all that much, but they showed Buck Privates Come Home a lot. So when they finally showed Buck Privates, I looked in the newspaper and showed it to my dad. I'm like, oh, they made a misprint. It's supposed to be Buck Privates Come Home. He's like, no, that's the first one, Buck Privates. Oh. So being a little desperate for ideas, Universal came to them with an idea. Someone came up with the idea of having them run into three of Universal's famous monsters from the earlier period. Universal monster movies had kind of two phases. You had 1931 through 1936 that started with Dracula and then Frankenstein and then through The Mummy and The Invisible Man, and ending with the two sequels, Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula's Daughter. Then Carl Laemmle died and his son got fired, and they shelved all those. And then in 1939, they decided to start them up again, so they did Son of Frankenstein in 1939. They did The Invisible Man Returns and The Mummy's Hand in 1940, and then picked them up from there. And then, of course, they said, well, we got one monster, why not two? So they came up with Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. It's like, well, we got two, why not three? And then they did House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula with all three of them, even though they barely interact during any of them. It's the funniest thing. So this time, they would have the Frankenstein monster, Dracula, and the Wolfman all interacting, and Bud and Lou being stuck in the middle. Lou absolutely hated the idea. Thought it was the stupidest idea in the world. Said he couldn't conceive of this, how this would possibly even work. Somebody at Universal, though, really wanted this to happen. So they said, why don't we get Charles Barton to direct? You guys like him. He's done some of your best work. So with that as an enticement, they decided to do the film Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. So the plot ends up being Bud and Lou are Chick Young and Wilbur Gray. They work at a shipping center, and there are some shenanigans at the opening part of the movie where people are trying to compete to get this big box. It's like first this woman comes in, she wants it, and then the head of McDougal's House of Horrors wants it, and then they end up messing around with the box. And so McDougal gets mad. He's like, okay, I want you guys to bring this to my House of Horrors, and you open it up, make sure everything's fine. And the weird thing was Channel 11 never showed that opening segment. I didn't see that opening sequence until either the late 80s and early 90s on AMC when they were showing the Abbott and Costello movies. So this is what trying to jam movies into an hour and a half time slot from 11:30 to 1 on a Sunday morning will get you. So anyway, there's actually two boxes. Supposedly one has the Frankenstein's monster and the other one has Count Dracula. Of course, Chick doesn't believe it, but Wilbur's worried, so they bring the two things in, and sure enough, Dracula emerges from his coffin, played this time by the original Dracula himself, Bela Lugosi. His first time redoing the character since 1931. In between, it was played by John Carradine and Lon Chaney Jr. So then he wakes up the Frankenstein monster in this movie, played by Glenn Strange, who had played it in the two House movies, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula. He was a big guy. Universal's kind of stock bad guy. He ended up playing Butch Cavendish in the opening episodes of The Lone Ranger. And then had his most profitable job and most famous job being the nice guy bartender on Gunsmoke for, I think, the last 10 years of the show. So nice guys do end up finishing first. But in the meantime, while that's happening, Lawrence Talbot comes to town and tries to warn them that Dracula and Frankenstein are going to cause problems. What he doesn't tell them directly is that he's the Wolfman. So he actually has Wilbur, which is Lou, lock him in his room while the moon comes up, and he starts turning into the Wolfman. But Wilbur keeps going into his room to give him. Oh, I forgot to give him something. So he keeps going in. The monster keeps trying to attack him, and he doesn't do it. So it ends up being the three guys are fighting, and eventually it turns out that Dracula wants to take Wilbur's brain and put it in the monster so he can have a smarter brain. Now, of course, the joke's how is he any smarter than you? And there's some really frightening sequences in it. I remember this, as I mentioned, this is the first Abbott and Costello movie I ended up seeing when I was a kid, and actually the first also Universal horror movie I saw. And they were able to balance the horror portion, like it's there's some scary sequences with a lot of the humor. Like, tonight when the moon comes up, I'm going to turn into a wolf. You and 20 million other guys, you know. And that was, I think, the key to the movie, is balancing the comedy and the horror. And it ended up being a template going forward for movies that wanted to do horror and comedy. They look back, like, when you take the craziest ideas, learn how to balance the scary and the funny, and Abbott and Costello meets Frankenstein probably did it one of the best in Hollywood history along the way. A couple interesting bits in it. Like I mentioned, this is the first time since the original Dracula that Bela Lugosi played Count Dracula, and it was actually the last time he had a big film studio want him to do any work. You know, those Poverty Row PRC Monogram films where he was cranking those out one after the other, and basically ended up going back to that until Ed Wood salvaged him with some with the stock footage in Plan 9. Now, Lon Chaney Jr. was, I think, the only one of the whole time who played the same character all the way through in every movie that the Wolfman appeared. He always played Lawrence Talbot. He was the only one. And he actually ended up returning to play the Frankenstein monster in one scene. He played the monster in Ghost of Frankenstein. Oddly enough, Bela Lugosi played him in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. So 3 out of the 4 Frankensteins were actually in this movie. What had happened is during the end, when the monster was supposed to pick up Lenore Albert, Glenn Strange tripped on a cable and actually broke his ankle. So he couldn't do any work that day. So they had to get the scene shot. So they asked Lon Chaney Jr., would you put the makeup on and just throw her out the window? So the scene of Dr. Mornay getting heaved out the window by the monster, that's actually Lon Chaney. And then the scene cuts around, and I think Lon Chaney is like untying Lou right before he changes into the Wolfman again. So he's like almost in the same scene. There was an earlier thing like that where they used some stock footage, and Lon Chaney's watching the monster, but it's actually stock footage from him in Ghost of Frankenstein. It's very, very confusing. Now, the only one of the original monsters who didn't appear in this movie was Boris Karloff, who basically, due to health reasons, couldn't put that heavy makeup on again after he did it in Son of Frankenstein 1939. And he was kind of dubious about the film as well. He really didn't want to have anything to do with it. So Universal just asked him, well, could you do some publicity for the film? He's like, so he agreed, but just don't make me see it. So there's this promo shot of him buying a ticket to see the movie, but I don't know if he ever ended up seeing it. But eventually it was so well received that he decided to get in on the action in their next horror film, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. One of the other interesting things about Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein is it was a very significant film in Jerry Garcia's life. He saw it, I think, right around the time his father passed away, and it scared him, but he kind of was able to relate to it. So it turned out to be a very influential film in his life. So if you can understand where some of the solos in Dark Star came from, that would explain it. And it actually has been saved in the National Film Registry as a significant piece of American cinema. So it has that going for it. And it would also set up a long list of Abbott and Costello Meets films to come over the next several years. So 1949 rolls around and the boys get right back to work right where they left off. They actually even were able to do a movie for another company again. That codicil was still in their contract. They did the movie Africa Screams. Now, it's another weird one for me because Channel 11, at least while I was alive, they never showed it as part of their Abbott and Costello Sunday morning 11:30 movie rotation. Very few of the other movies worked their way in. I think The Noose Hangs High and Dance with Me, Henry were really the only two that were there on a regular basis. Later on, they did some of the color films. Even though the film fell into the public domain, I didn't get a chance to see it on TV until it was on one of these obscure local New Jersey cable channels. Like one morning at like 10 o'clock, I was like just off from, I think it was probably off from college or something like that. All of a sudden I flip around, oh, there's African Screams. Let me finally watch it. It's odd how it fell into the public domain somehow. It's like everywhere. And you can get the cheapest and worst looking copies on videotape, on DVD, now Blu-ray, though supposedly they have restored it and it's very nice. There's not really any fantasy element to this. There's kind of a one-off joke with a big giant gorilla that kind of looks like King Kong. So, or just basically just a giant gorilla. He doesn't even look like King Kong. He looks like just a guy in a giant suit superimposed, and Lou is walking by him. So that's really all for that film. The other movie in 1949 they did of importance is when Boris Karloff got into the act. And it's one of the most inappropriately named movies of all time. It's called Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff. Now, spoiler alert, Boris Karloff is not the killer. I don't know why they named it like that, but anyway, in that movie, it's kind of a twist on a haunted house thing. It's a haunted hotel thing, in a sense. It's maybe like Abbott and Costello's version of And Then There Were None. They're at a hotel, and I think they're like detectives. Or I think Bud's a detective, and I think Lou is like a janitor or something like that. I haven't seen it in a while, but I remember a lot of the stuff clearly. And people start turning up dead, so they have to investigate. And Boris Karloff plays a swami who hypnotizes people, so they're thinking he hypnotizes people, and they end up dead. But it turns out there's another killer out there, and there's this really cool scene that takes place kind of underneath the hotel in a cavern. And the killer chases through there, and he's dressed up in kind of like he's going to Niagara Falls. He's got the raincoat and the rain hat on, and he's got a mask on. Almost looks like the killer from I Know What You Did Last Summer, sort of like that. I wonder if it was inspired by that. But anyway, he traps Lou in a hole in the ground, and he like breaks open the wall, and there's just water pouring in, and he tries to drown him, but he gets rescued. So it's not really a horror film per se. It's more like a mystery, but it's fairly well done. It's just the fact that they say the killer, they meet the killer, Boris Karloff, and Boris Karloff's not the killer. This is not the last time Boris worked with the boys. We'll get to that in a couple minutes. So they kept working. In 1950, they did Abbott and Costello and the Foreign Legion. Nothing really fantasy there. There's a Mirage thing where they're trapped out in the desert, and this newsboy comes up, and it turns out it's Leo Gorcey's brother from whatever you want to call them, the Dead End Kids, the East Side Kids, the Bowery Boys, whatever you want to call them. And it's funny, they would actually battle on New York television on Sundays. It's like on Channel 11, Abbott and Costello will be on at 11:30, and then on noon on Sundays, You'd have the Bowery Boys, but then I think they moved to Saturdays after Soul Train at one point. But at one point they were competing. So the newsboy is David Gorcey, but like I said, the rest of the film deals with wrestling. Very strange. Now, when you get to 1951, they go back to horror, and it's Abbott and Costello meet the Invisible Man, and this time it's not the doctor who does the invisibility, but it's a fighter, Tommy Nelson, and he's like framed for a crime, and so this doctor, who actually has a picture of Claude Rains on his wall, so it's like it's supposed to be Dr. Griffin. So he injects him with the invisibility thing. So Tommy teams up with Abbott and Costello to try to solve the mystery that's involved him to try to unframe himself, as it were. And the climax of the movie ends up in the boxing ring, which is actually interesting because Lou, before he went out to Hollywood, was a fighter in Patterson. He was actually pretty successful. He did I think 25 fights or something like that, and then he got knocked out. And then his mother found out he was fighting, so she said, "You're not doing that anymore." So that's kind of why he went out to Hollywood. But it's one of those things where Lou is pretending to punch, but Tommy's really doing the punching. So it's on the borderline horror. It's actually also, I think, one of the last movies William Frawley did before he started doing I Love Lucy. And then he basically did TV the rest of his life. He did I Love Lucy and then went on to My Three Sons. So William Frawley had actually been their boss in One Night in the Tropics way back at the beginning. So it was kind of a bookend there. Now, actually, this was the second time Abbott and Costello met the Invisible Man. At the end of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, they just seen the Frankenstein monster drop into the water, and Chick and Wilbur are sitting in the boat, and they're like, "Thank God we're done with monsters." And all of a sudden, you see this cigarette fly in the air, and the Invisible Man is in the boat with them, and they got Vincent Price to do the voice of the Invisible Man, and he had done the Invisible Man in the sequel, Invisible Man Returns. And it's interesting that they just happened to pick somebody who had a good voice back then. Little did they know that he would become such an iconic horror figure later on in the Corman films, and then solidified it by doing the voiceover at the end of Michael Jackson's Thriller. So it's like you have several generations that sit there, they hear that voice, and they know who that is. So it was a good call on their part. Now, they made another movie in 1951, Coming Round the Mountain. It's kind of a hillbilly story. But it had a very weird sequence in the middle. At one point, Bud and Lou go out to the woods and they find this old witch in a log cabin. And the witch, appropriately enough, is played by Margaret Hamilton. Yes, the Wicked Witch of the West herself. Not Cora, the coffee woman, as we kids of the 70s first knew her as before we watched The Wizard of Oz. So the witch ends up making this, they want this love potion to help Lou have this girl that he likes fall in love with her. And of course, later on, they do get it. And of course, it doesn't go properly. But when she asks for her payment, they don't feel like paying until they actually see that it works. So the witch makes up this kind of voodoo doll and starts sticking pins in it. It looks just like Lou, and he starts jumping around. So later on, as Bud starts arguing with her, he goes up and he makes a voodoo doll of the witch and starts sticking pins in her. So they end up sticking pins in each other and start screaming. The weird fantasy things of Abbott and Costello. Then by the time they got to 1952, they ended up doing a couple of movies for Warner Brothers. And the interesting thing about both of them were they were in color. Now, for some reason, they didn't want to pay for Technicolor. So there was some other process called Super Cinecolor or something like that. So it didn't quite look as good. So it's like you always think of Abbott Costello in black and white, and here they are in this color movie, and it's not quite Gone with the Wind color, anything like that. So they just had to do their budgets where they could. One of them was a meets movie, but it doesn't have anything to do with horror, except if you want to imagine Charles Laughton doing comedy. Abbott and Costello Meet Captain Kidd. You do get to see Hillary in color, which is definitely a plus. But he wanted to do the movie simply because he wanted to do comedy and he wanted to learn from the best. So he wanted to do Lou Costello. Now, the other movie is almost their version of The Wizard of Oz. They did a version of Jack and the Beanstalk, and it starts out in the modern day in black and white, or should I say sepia tone, because it's very brown and white, the opening section of the movie. And Bud and Lou are babysitters, and they're going to go tell a story to the kid that they're babysitting. And when they go tell the actual story of Jack and the Beanstalk, it turns to color. Buddy Bear played the giant. He was actually in, him and his brother Max were in Africa Screams. They played a couple of fighters, oddly enough. And Buddy's nephew Max Jr. later tried his hand at comedy and did very well. He was Jethro on the Beverly Hillbillies. So it's also a little bit of a throwback because it's also a musical in that there's a lot of songs in the color segment. And so it was kind of a strange thing for Abbott and Costello to do, but they did it. And once again, the interesting thing about it in my life is, as I mentioned, it wasn't in Channel 11's normal rotation of Abbott and Costello movies. I first remember it and Abbott and Costello and Captain Kidd on Channel 2, because CBS was actually for the longest time in New York City. It was the first real movie station. If you look on IMDb and you see where a lot of movies were first broadcast, it's WCBS, first on WCBS in 1948 or something like that. So they had a lot of movies in their stable, and they had the MGM movies. They had Rio Rita, they had Lost in the Harem, and they had Epic Style in Hollywood, and they had the two color films. But I had never seen it, so I was looking forward at one point to finally getting around to seeing it. So I'm looking in the newspaper, and for you younger people out there, if we wanted to know something what was on TV the week coming up, we'd have to look in the newspaper and see it listed and see what channel things were on. We'd either do that, the local newspaper would have it, or there was actually a magazine called TV Guide, and its sole purpose was to tell you what was on the next week. And every market in the country was different. You get TV, it would be the same like stories in it. Like, you'd look on a cover and it's Dick Van Dyke, it's on all over the country. But if you go in New York, it had Channel 2, Channel 4, Channel 7, Channel 5, Channel 9. You go to Philly, Channel 3, Channel 6, Channel 10. You go out to Chicago, Channel 9, Channel 32, and all across the country. So I look at the paper and I saw Abbott and Costello, Jack and the Beanstalk was going to be on Channel 2 that coming Saturday at like 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So I'm like, I told my dad, I'm like, oh, good, Jack and the Beanstalk's going to be on. I'm finally going to get a chance to see it. And he's like, well, we're going to Grandma Hartshar's this weekend. So I'm like, oh, that's no big deal. I'll just watch it on Channel 22, which at the time was WDAU in Wilkes-Barre. It was the CBS affiliate. And he's like, I don't think it's going to be on there. He's like, well, it's Channel 2 is CBS. So needless to say, we go out to Grandma Hartshar's, and it's Saturday. My cousin Jimmy wanted to go out playing. Like, no, I have to go watch Abbott and Costello. He's like, I don't think Abbott and Costello's on. So I go in Grandma's living room, turn on the TV, turn on Channel 22, and it's not Abbott and Costello and Jack and the Beanstalk. It's something different. So that was like the first time I had to deal with the concept of network and local. So I finally sunk in, like, oh, the local TV. That's why Channel 16 has Hachi Malachi, but Channel 7 or Channel 6 doesn't. Oh, it's finally started to sink in at that point. So anyway, and needless to say, also at the end of Jack and the Beanstalk, it goes back to black and white, or should I say sepia and white. So it really does mirror The Wizard of Oz in that way. Now, also in 1952, that's when they started the TV show that ended up running for 2 seasons. But we knew as kids, whenever the Yankees on Channel 11 would either have a rainout or the game ended early, we would get an episode of Abbott and Costello. It was the funniest thing. It's like, you would know. It's like, they would have, I think usually Abbott and Costello would either be on, like, at one point, I think it was on like weekdays at 4 o'clock, or then it was on every Saturday at like 1 or like 3 after the Chiller Theater, when it was on in the afternoon or something like that. But it was always like the default programming whenever the Yankees were involved. And like I said, either the game ended early or the game got rained out. I prefer the first season over the second. The first season was kind of more coherent. It also had Hillary, so something more fun to look at. So while they were doing that, they also ended up doing some things on NBC's Colgate Comedy Hour. They sort of kind of alternated on and off with Martin and Lewis, and I think somebody else in the mix there. But in 1953, they had not one but two fantasy/sci-fi related movies. The first one featured the return of Boris Karloff. This time, he played Dr. Jekyll in Abbott and Costello meets Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It takes place in London around the turn of the century, and in this thing, Boris Karloff is Dr. Jekyll, and he's doing his experiments and occasionally turns into Mr. Hyde, who doesn't really speak. He's made up kind of like Frederick March's Mr. Hyde, but like worse. It's kind of like a cross between Frederick March's Mr. Hyde and the Wolfman. Bud and Lou are there, and they just notice that strange things are going on at the Jekyll house, and Jekyll's like young ward is being courted by one of their friends. But it turns out kind of a sick thing when you think about it. Dr. Jekyll wants to marry his own niece or whoever she was. It's like it's very disturbing when you look back at it. They have this the big giant dude. I think he was the same guy who played the tall guy in The Thing, but he stayed silent in this movie. He's kind of like precursor to Lurch, as it were. And then the funniest sequence was they're in the basement and they're looking and they find all these weird formulas and they take one and Lou turns into a mouse. And so he's talking to Bud as a mouse and he's got the little face on with the whiskers moving. That's funny. So then there's the finale. Ends up Lou accidentally gets jabbed with the Mr. Hyde formula. So at the end of the movie, there's not one, but there's two Mr. Hydes running around. It's like one of them's Boris Karloff, stuntman, I should say. And the other one is Lou, or Lou's stuntman, I should say. I think it might have been his brother even. But so there's a lot of confusion there. And I remember as kids, we would always play like on the outside of like the jungle gyms. We'd play like, because Dr. Jekyll, when he turned into Mr. Hyde, would climb up the trellis. And at the end of the movie, the trellis doesn't quite hold up and he falls down and then he turns into Dr. Jekyll at the end, lying in the street. Sorry for the spoiler, but you know Dr. Jekyll doesn't survive in any of these movies. But then Bud takes Lou in as Dr. Jekyll and brings him into the police station. He bites all the policemen and then turns back into Lou. I think Tubby was the character. But all the policemen have turned into Mr. Hyde. So strange movie there, but yeah. So instead of doing something from Universal, they did something from Paramount or MGM. But obviously, Spencer Tracy didn't go that far when he turned into Mr. Hyde. The other film is another inappropriately named film. Abbott Costello Go to Mars. The only problem is where they end up going to Venus at the end of the film, not Mars. They never get anywhere near Mars. And it's actually a precursor for those of you who grew up in the 70s and were Bob Denver fans. It's almost a precursor to Far Out Space Nuts, where they're preparing, Bud and Lou are preparing a rocket ship for launch, and they end up accidentally hitting the launch codes. And if you remember the opening of Far Out Space Nuts, breakfast, lunch. I said lunch, not launch. So they end up flying, and they end up landing. First, they land in New Orleans at Mardi Gras. So they think they're on some weird planet because everybody's in these crazy masks and everything. And then somehow a couple of criminals end up stowing away on the rocket. And then the rocket ends up into space. And then they end up going to Venus. And needless to say, Venus is a planet with all sexy girls on it. In fact, Anita Ekberg is one of the girls there before she had her run of fame in the 60s. So the special effects are very cheesy, but they're actually kind of kind of good. The rocket is, you could tell it's superimposed over a lot of shots, but there's this great shot, and it's Lou's New Jersey, North Jersey homecoming. He's like, "Oh, you got a nickel? We're going through the Lincoln Tunnel." Literally, you see the rocket ship going in and out of Lincoln Tunnel. Though I don't know how they got out of it, because they would get out on right by where Port Authority is now, and there's not a lot of room there for them to fly out. And then there's a great joke at the end of the movie where the spaceship is coming in for a landing, and they're going back through New York again, and they go right towards the Statue of Liberty, and they yell, "Duck, lady, duck!" And also the Statue of Liberty ducks down, and the rocket flies overhead. Oh, I don't know how they came up with that one. I don't know why. I guess Abbott and Costello Goes to Venus doesn't ring as well as Abbott and Costello Go to Mars. Plus, 1953 was also the year that the War of the Worlds film by George Powell came out. So I guess they're kind of playing off that. So late in 1953, Lou's rheumatic fever came up again and struck him so bad that they were actually making a movie called Fireman Save My Child, and he had to drop out and really couldn't do heavy work for the next year through 1954. So they didn't cancel the film; they just replaced Bud and Lou in the cast with the well-known comedic duo of Hugh O'Brien and Buddy Hackett. How it's like, did they just go through the list of people who were under contract to just okay, just put those two guys in the movie? But interestingly enough, Buddy Hackett had a later connection with Lou. 25 years later, in the late 70s on NBC, they made a movie about Bud and Lou, and Harvey Korman played Bud Abbott, and Buddy Hackett was Lou Costello, and it was a big thing for us kids. It's like, hey, we got to see on network something that we enjoyed on regular TV, and they documented all the thing about Lou Costello Jr. falling in, Bud's unfortunate bouts with alcoholism. So it wasn't all fun and games. So Lou basically had to lay low through most of 1954. They did the occasional things on, like I said, the Colgate Comedy Hour. And their one appearance on the Colgate Comedy Hour is somewhat significant in that it provided them with the full cadre of Universal horror movies, monsters. We know they met Frankenstein, they met Dracula, they met the Wolfman, they met the Invisible Man. They're going to meet the Mummy. I'll get to that in a minute. But the last main one from Universal, it would be Creature from the Black Lagoon. So there was obviously not going to have time to make Abbott and Costello meet the Creature from the Black Lagoon because they were still making the movies and making them seriously. But there is a segment on the show, I guess, to promote the film, where Lou is some kind of dream sequence on YouTube. And he's running into all the different monsters. And right at the end of the sketch where he thinks everything is safe, the Creature from the Black Lagoon comes out and harasses him, and then it fades to black. It's not technically Abbott and Costello meet Creature from the Black Lagoon, but it's like as close as we're going to get. Now, in 1955, things were starting to fall apart again between Bud and Lou. Their Universal contract was kind of coming to an end because obviously with them on TV and Lou being sick, they weren't the number one box office draws like they were in the 40s. So they had a chance to go out kind of on top. They put together a film called Abbott and Costello Meet the Keystone Cops. And it was all about, first, film studios in North Jersey. I think it was in West Caldwell or something like that. And then they go out to Hollywood, and then they end up getting involved with a crook played by the inimitable Fred Clark, who ended up being a great straight man for them because that's what he did in all his films. And they had a nice finale with the Keystone Cops with their shenanigans of pulling the car apart of the railroad tracks and all that other fun stuff. That would have been the perfect film for them to go out on top with. But they had to go to the well one more time, and we got Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. Now, they had stopped making the Mummy films back in the 40s, like everything else. The original was in the 30s, and then they did 4 sequels. Lon Chaney Jr. actually played the mummy in the last three. Though I'm pretty sure there's like one of them. If you had told me that's not really Lon Chaney Jr. in there, I would have believed it because it's like it just doesn't look like him underneath the makeup. The other two was like, oh, okay, I can see it. But whatever lessons they seem to have learned from Abbott Costello Meet Frankenstein, they kind of forgot it in Abbott Costello Meet the Mummy. I mean, they didn't use like the original names. Instead of Karis and Ankara, I think it's Claris with an L, and Ananka. The mummy makeup / bandages, like you could tell they just. I went down to the grocery store or the pharmacy, grabbed a bunch of ace bandages, and wrapped up the stunt man to play the mummy. So it wasn't quite as frightening. And then one of the main, we think, antagonists in the movie is played by Richard Deacon, albeit without his glasses. You know, how frightening is Richard Deacon going to be? It's like if you need someone to ward off Richard Deacon, go get Maury Amsterdam. Oh, look, Mr. Potato Head. Rob, make him stop. If you want to see a frightening Richard Deacon, hunt out the episode of Love American Style. I think it was like 1972, like right before that series ended, where he's in like this hippie wig that I think Peter Sellers wore in I Love You, Alice B. Toklas, and he's trying to make the moves on an 18-year-old Ann Archer. That's scary. If you want to see scary Richard Deacon, that's scary. But needless to say, they didn't put a lot of effort. They put so little effort into it that Bud and Lou's characters are actually named in the end of the film. Paul and Freddie, I think but they call each other Bud and Lou through the whole movie. It's just like, kind of like a Larry Buchanan thing. They just didn't care. No. Unfortunately, that was their last film for Universal. Oddly enough, their last film altogether was made for another company, as I mentioned, of the film in 1956, Dance with Me, Henry. Takes place at a carnival, so there's nothing fantasy involved there. And at that point, like later in 1957, the boys decided to just call it quits at that point. Bud was having some of his own issues, so Lou decided to kind of try to make a career for himself. He actually ended up doing an episode of Wagon Train, kind of like a dramatic episode where he played one of the people that they run into along the way, and Major Adams helps out. So want to see Ward Bond and Lou Costello in one movie? It exists. It's there. I think it's the Tobias Jones story, if I remember right. I saw pieces of it once, and you kind of have to take a step back and say, okay, just Lou is not going to be funny in this, and he did pretty good. He could have been a decent actor like that. But then he got a chance to make his own solo film, and oddly enough, it did end up being kind of fantasy sci-fi related. It was called The 30-Foot Bride of Candy Rock. And as the name implies, it's sort of a funny take on the previous year's Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Except this time, instead of the you don't want to cross her, Allison Hayes, you never want to cross her, Harry. They kind of do the flip side of that and get kind of a sweet presence to be the poor unfortunate victim of Lou's experiments, his girlfriend. And she was played by Dorothy Provine. I think it was one of her earliest films. Supposedly, at one point, she was best known with some people for being, I think, Pinky Pinkerton is the name of the character on the show The Roaring Twenties. The thing is, I think they've lost that show. I don't even know if it exists because I think I've seen one clip of it on YouTube, and it looked like kind of like the old kinescopes of like General Hospital or something like that. So looks like something that would be on Channel 7 at 3:30 in the morning. But us modern viewers would know her from her 60s movies. It's a Mad World, The Great Race, and I think she was in That Darn Cat as Disney switched from the Haley Mills era to the Dean Jones era. So anyway, the 30-Foot Bride of Candy Rock is the usual shenanigans. That's just it. Lou is kind of a mad not a mad scientist, but a scientist on his own. He tries out this formula, and his girlfriend grows to 30 feet. Not really very memorable. I've seen it twice. It was the one Lou Costello movie that Channel 7 had, and I actually ended up seeing it about 10 years ago on this kind of Antenna's sister channel back when it was. Not exactly a highlight of Lou's career, and unfortunately, he didn't even really get a chance to see it because in 1959 he had a heart attack from all those bouts of rheumatic fever, and he ended up passing away. So it was an unfortunate end for a guy who brought a lot of laughs into a lot of people's lives. But their influence was very long lasting. Universal did in 1965, they put together a compilation film called The World of Abbott and Costello, and it got a lot of play. It was part of Channel 11's rotation. And they had a very big fan and a very popular comedian, a guy by the name of Jerry Seinfeld. Jerry Seinfeld was a huge Abbott and Costello fan, so he did his own Abbott and Costello special on NBC, right when Seinfeld was really becoming a hit, so he had the clout to do it. So a lot of the banter on Seinfeld between Jerry and George, kind of has that Abbott and Costello feel to it. I mean, Jerry's tall and skinny, and George is short and short and stocky, husky. Now, from this, as you've heard, I've mentioned a lot about my own experiences with Abbott and Costello. And the funny thing is, even though I was born in North Jersey, I was born in Passaic, a couple towns over from Paterson, I really kind of relate Abbott and Costello to where my dad grew up outside of Wilkes-Barre, because he'd always mention, like, every time a movie came on, I remember seeing this at the Roosevelt Theater on Shoemaker Street. And he lived in Swarsville, Pennsylvania. If you look on Google Earth, on Shoemaker Street, the Roosevelt Theater, the building is still there. Because I remember back when I started getting into Abbott and Costello, and my dad mentioned, I saw him at the Roosevelt Theater. So we go visit Grandma Harcher. We go into, go driving around. And my dad said, "This is it. This is the Roosevelt Theater." I'm like, "Oh my God, it's like right across the street from my grandmother worked at the pants factory." The building is still there. Now, I don't know when. I'd have to probably check with my Uncle Andy, or maybe my Uncle Jimmy knows. One of the two of them would know, because they were the Swarsville boys. The Roosevelt Theater closed down at some point. And in 1972, that area of northeastern Pennsylvania, the Wilkes-Barre area, had a huge flood from Hurricane Agnes. So it like flooded everything out with like 20 feet of water. It was horrible. So the Roosevelt Theater has been closed at least since then, if not before. And the building is still there. I just showed it to my son. I put it up and said, "Look, this is where my dad saw all the Abbott and Costello movies." Now, I actually do have one Abbott and Costello connection that does relate to New Jersey, and North Jersey in particular. Back in 1982, 40 years ago already. Oh, boy. Me and my buddy Ray, we were at our church youth convocation out in Albion, Michigan, and they had a talent show one night. So we decided, why don't we try doing Abbott and Costello? I mean, I was, Abbott and Costello fan. He was also a big Abbott and Costello fan. He was from Clifton, which is the next town over from Paterson. So we would watch it on Channel 11 all the time. So we both had that in common. So we rehearsed it before we got there, and we made sure. And we noticed where we would get stuck. We'd get stuck in the naturally section towards the end. So we just had to keep in mind, just to remember. And he pointed to me and said, "Well, you have to do the out, and he better get it." So that was always a remember. It's like, okay, I have to remember to get out. So we went up there and we did it. We were actually towards the end. Somehow we lucked out. And we did it, and we basically got off. We did it without a hitch. We did get slightly mixed up towards the naturally section, but I got us out finally. And what shocked us was the reaction of the kids there. The adults we knew kind of knew it, but I don't think they had heard it before. They were in absolute hysterics. We were just like looking at you when we were done, and people came up to us. I was like, "How did you guys read? That was so funny. Where'd you hear that?" And I was like, "Wow." And well, we went over pretty well. But it was the fact that the kids, kids our age, we all knew it here out in Jersey, but we had kids from up in the Boston area, up in Massachusetts, up in Pennsylvania, out in Michigan, and most of them had never heard it. So it was a bit of a shock to us. So, as I mentioned, Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein is so culturally significant that it has been saved in the National Film Registry as, I guess, kind of like their example of the horror comedy genre. And you could draw examples from it later: Young Frankenstein, Ghostbusters to some extent. You could almost draw a line back through those to Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein. And of course, you can see a lot of movies along the way where they didn't quite get it right. So anyway, thanks a lot for listening to my rambling for Halloween this year. Like I said, I had a very busy month, didn't have time to sit down and write something. So all of this was just kind of off the top of my head. As much as I could remember as I went through the years and remembered the movie. So thanks a lot for listening. You could find, I think, most of the movies are on the Abbott and Costello Complete Universal Collection. Jack and the Beanstalk, I know, I think they've restored it recently, so it's on I think it's on a different label. I don't know if it's Kino or another one. Or I think most of them are streaming somewhere. I'm sure they're probably on Tubi or Pluto, on one of those multiple channels. That's the great thing. I don't even have to worry about trying to see it on channel 2 or channel 22. It's like it's always there. What a world of difference. Next time, it'll be back to real fantasy. The Fall of Numenor should be out in mid-November. So once I get a chance to read it and double check a little things on marketing and things like that, I think I'll do a video episode for it so we can see which books are which. And I'll see if I can maybe do some screenshots and things like that. So we can have some visual aids. So we'll see how the marketing of Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, helped and hurt it along the way. That'll be next time on Valleys of Numenor. Please hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing. I'm Don Hartshorn. Thanks for listening.